Welcome back into Southwest Bias, and I am super excited to welcome in my next guest. It's that Levine, former general manager with the Minnesota Twins, and now works with a guy I know well, and I apologize that you got to share a podcast with him, Ryan McDonough, on Rosters to Rings. How are you, Thad?
I'm doing great, Espo. And Ryan's been awesome to work with. His experiences from working with the Celtics and the Suns have been excellent. His media experience, he's been a guiding light for me, a mentor through the process, and a heck of a person to work with.
Well, we can talk about him off air. That's fine. So really glad to have you. And I really want to know, obviously, trade deadline day in Major League Baseball. What is it like to sit in that seat? What is it like to be in the general manager's office on deadline day? How chaotic is it? And what is that experience like for a general manager?
I wish I could tell you this isn't the case, but it is true. It is very deadline driven. So, I think the numbers support that about 70% of the deals are made within 90 minutes of the deadline. About 60% are made within like 30 to 45 minutes of the deadline. So, what it is these meetings are a ton of prep work, a lot of scenario playing, a lot of conversations, a lot of calls, a lot of information gathering. And then you ready on the last day to buckle up and do the best you can to stay above the fray and try to get deals done. Because when you actually agree to a deal, you then have to review medicals, you have to exchange financial statements relative to the contracts, you got to sort all those things out. Every detail has to be ironed out before the deal can be made final, and all of that has to be done before the deadline. So I think a lot of teams will wait to the end, believing they get the best offers at that time. But also, sometimes you're compromised. You're not then afforded the latitude to go through your full process of review. You've got to make snapper judgments. And so I think you trust the people in the room, you trust the information that's been provided for you, but then ultimately you have to show real judgment at the last, because sometimes these things start happening very quickly towards the deadline.
So a lot of it happens in that last 90 minutes, but how much groundwork are you laying in the weeks before that? Like, I can't imagine that a lot of deals are one call towards the end of the deadline and you're agreeing on something. I imagine it's a lot of effort leading up to that.
Well, and I think it's variable shop to shop. So I'll give you some extremes. AJ Preller is famous for being very active as the general manager of the San Diego Padres. He's a guy who literally makes 90, if not 100% of the team's calls. So he is almost handling that singularly. Most teams that I've worked with, we've divided it up amongst 3, 4, 5 people. So to your point, Espo, like let's say I would be assigned 8 teams that I'm going to nurture relationships with. I would start those conversations in spring training, find out what your needs and surpluses were going into the season. I would then check back in the first part of the season. How's the season progressing for you guys? Anything changed on your front? And then I would try to start a cadence of talking at least every month until probably 2 to 3 weeks before the deadline, at which point I would start talking on a much more frequent basis with people. Because I think one of the worst feelings for a team is to read a trade rumor and say, oh my gosh, Brian Hayes just got traded to the Cincinnati Reds. We didn't even know he was available. We didn't even think to ask for him. Well, you don't know unless you're having very consistent conversations. And I think the reality is, and I'm not sure if this will upset fans or energize them, but when we're making a trade, we're not calling 29 teams and asking if they have interest. We're communicating with the teams that we think have the best fit, and then we're proceeding with the ones that seem to be the most interested and aggressive. So I think that it's your responsibility as a team to divvy up those communications and responsibilities, stay consistently connected with teams throughout the course of the year. If you just start the process at the trade deadline, most likely you've missed something and you haven't laid the necessary groundwork to get an effective deal done.
Mike Hazen took out here in Arizona, took a little bit of heat earlier in the week, and I don't think rightfully so, but he said, they've taken calls on pretty much everybody. But isn't that, as a general manager, due diligence to take the call from another team, to hear what they have to say, even if your stance is, I'm not going to move off this guy? Don't you have to at least take the phone call to understand what the market is out there?
I think that's our responsibility. We have to be able to communicate effectively to the ownership group. Here are all the options we have at our disposal, not just the ones that we thought worthy of pursuit. Because sometimes we get directives from ownership that maybe lie a little bit astray from what we thought was the best move, and we can only make those moves if we've had all the conversations. So I think, to your point, and to reflect what Mike Hazen's communicating, is he's not necessarily taking certain guys to market. But when somebody picks up the phone and says, "Hey, listen, if we backed up the truck for, player X, would you guys talk about it?" I think it's incumbent upon him just to understand, like, what does that backing up of the truck constitute? Because there probably should be a deal that we would do for the vast majority of our players, because at some point it just trips the wire and it just helps the organization too much not to consider those types of deals. If you're closed minded to those things, you'll never be presented with them. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to know all the options to help our teams, not just a narrow view of that.
When you have a team that's kind of on the cusp between competing and maybe falling back, how do you make the determination whether you're in the buyer's market or the seller's market? And how soon do you feel as a general manager you have to make that kind of delineation before the deadline comes up?
So I think you've got to do the best you can to objectively assess where you are in the competitive cycle. So, how many guys do you have who are going to matriculate to free agency at the end of the year? How many guys are on the backside of their control with you? How many of them, from an age perspective, are in their prime right now versus guys who are ending their prime? So I think all of that gives you some context as to where you are in the win now cycle and how much you should be pushing chips in to keep that window open versus, is it time to get a little bit aggressive and get out in front of making some moves? The other thing I would say, and I'm not sure if that question was specific to the Arizona Diamondbacks, but I think it's somewhat applicable, because the reality is, I look at them versus a team like Kansas City right now. Both teams are similarly placed in the standings. They're similarly below 500. They're similarly in the wild card race. Well, Kansas City is buying and Arizona's selling. So I think you got to look beyond just the superficial of the records and what are the underlying numbers and what do they suggest. And right now, the way Arizona is constituted is they have a kind of a wealth of potential free agents come season's end who are probably very highly valued. They've already traded one in Naylor. There's a few more that could be on the horizon here. But I also think it's circumstantial to the division. So when you play in one of the Western or Eastern divisions, there are payroll behemoths in those divisions. The Centrals don't necessarily have that. And so it's a little bit easier to make moves on the margins and change the trajectory of your competitive landscape in the American League Central and the National League Central than it is in the West or the East. So I think when you are in the West and the East, you're probably a little bit more inclined to have to take bold steps to try to compete with some of those big payroll teams. Whereas in the Central, you could be a little bit more subtle in your movements. And so that's, I think, the distinctions as I look at Kansas City and Arizona, who are in similar competitive situations right now. One's selling, one's buying. It actually makes a lot of sense to me why each of them is acting accordingly.
All right, I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit. Did you ever directly negotiate with Mike Hazen, and what is that experience like? Say I'm a general manager calling him up here in the last few hours. What is it like to negotiate with Mike Hazen?
So, Mike Hazen has a tremendous leadership team. Amiel Sadeh is his lieutenant, great friend and partner. And so we negotiated with both of those guys. And I think they both had very similar tacks, which is to say, like, they're a little bit of a throwback. They're very scout based in terms of some of their inputs. They're very intelligent. So they're tapping into databases as well as scouts. They're also a little bit more transparent in telling you what they're prepared to do and what they're not prepared to do. A lot of general managers in today's day and age are kind of hunting good deals. I think Amiel and Mike hunt good players. And so in order to hunt good players, you have to be a little bit more transparent in what your interests are in those players and what you're prepared to do to acquire them. I think the GMs who are really more focused on hunting good deals covet information. They're not necessarily sharing that. They would rather not get a deal done and retain the information. Mike and Amiel don't conduct themselves that way. They're willing to share a little bit of information in order to pursue the player that they really think is going to be impactful to the organization, whether that's today or in the future. I think the other thing about those two guys is they have a very clear track record of acting and being men of action. So they're either aggressively trying to help the team win today or build for the future. They rarely stand still at the deadline. If you look at their track records over the off seasons and the deadlines, they usually take measured steps towards one of those two goals, either trying to build for the immediate present or build for the future. So if I'm a fan of the Arizona Diamondbacks, I feel exceptionally emboldened with the leadership of Mike Hazen and Amiel Sadeh, who I think are two of the most intelligent guys who are leading organizations, but they're also very inclusive. They're getting a ton of information bubbled up to them. They're making very informed decisions, and they're not willing to hesitate to act. They will act, and I think that's something that fans should be very encouraged by. They're not going to sit on their hands and try to survive and secure their jobs for tomorrow. They're going to try to act today to try to help the organization thrive, whether now or in the future. And to me, as a fan, that would be very inspirational.
Final question for you. What's your best trade deadline story? What is one that you're willing to share about your experience at the deadline?
So two come to mind. One is a little bit more well known. In 2010 with the Texas Rangers, we ended up acquiring Cliff Lee, who really changed the trajectory for the whole franchise. We ended up going to the World Series that year. But what I'm going to talk about here is the acquisition of Cole Hamels in 2015. At that time, I think we were 3 games under 500, 8 games out of first place. I think we had a negative 44 run differential, and we ended up acquiring Cole Hamels, who also had 2 more years of control after that year. So we were going to have him for 2.5 seasons. And at the press conference, the media was asking John Daniels, the general manager at the time, like, so this was a move for the future. This seems like a pretty prudent move, but you gave up a lot of prospects. He said, this wasn't a move for the future. We're going to win this division. And it was like one of those needle scratching on the record moments where everyone was like, oh my God, like he actually thinks this will help us win. And I'll be darned, from that moment forward, we went through the roof. And I think we all as executives aspire, if the team puts you in a position where you have a chance to win, you aspire to do your part to support them and hopefully build that championship culture. I think that was one of those singular, most pronounced times in my career where I saw the actions of a front office actually genuinely motivate a team. The team wasn't performing nearly as poorly as the record would suggest at that time, but the facts were the facts. We were 8 games out of first place. We ultimately went on a run after that and win the division, go into the playoffs and play Toronto. We didn't seem like we were positioned to do that. The trade poised us to strike, but the general manager's kind of confidence in the team and his bold expression of that, I think, really propelled the team forward.
Well, he is Thad Levine, host or co-host of Rosters to Rings. He's a man that's been in the room where it happens. If you want more of that insight, listen to him and Ryan McDonough on the podcast. Thad, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Espo. Great being on.